Okay, so good morning, everybody. Today we are going to be learning chapter 30. Wow. I know I always start the chapter saying that this chapter is an amazing chapter, but it happens to be that this chapter really is a very, very practical, applicable, very gives us very practical, applicable tools for our everyday lives, literally every single day. So, hi, good morning, Panina. Okay, so this chapter continues the theme of Timtum Halev, which means we are treating a plugged heart. What does a plugged heart mean? Just to remind ourselves, a plugged heart means that the light of the Nefesh Elokis is not able to penetrate the klipa or shell surrounding the heart of the animal soul, and therefore the Nefesh Elokis, the divine soul, is not able to have an effect on the animal soul at all. No matter how much you control your mind, you're not able to have control over your heart. And therefore, the Alter Rebbe in the last chapter started giving us various techniques how to unplug this heart. And basically, the Alter Rebbe started by giving different techniques, which entail becoming brokenhearted. We mentioned that brokenhearted does not mean in this case like a sadness, but hearted actually means breaking the shell around the heart in order for the light to penetrate. In other words, in this case, this is a technique when all else has not worked. This is a technique whereby we're not going to actually increase the light, but we're going to make the heart more receptive to the light. And then the end of the chapter, the Alter Rebbe gave us a technique which is an SOS, urgent emergency measure technique of raging at the Yetzer Hara. And why raging at the Yetzer Hara and the Nefesh HaBahamis is effective is because by raging at the Yetzer Hara, you're actually distancing yourself from the Yetzer Hara. You're telling yourself, this is not me. This is just simply my Yetzer Hara and my animal soul. It's only my perception of me. It is the Beinoni's perception of himself, and therefore he rages at the Yetzer Hara, calling the Yetzer Hara all sorts of names as listed in Tanya, in order to overcome or bring down or deflate the Yetzer Hara quite quickly. Now, this chapter is continuing this theme of solving the problem of Timtum Halev, of solving this plugged heart, of unplugging our heart, right? Of making our heart receptive, and gives us an amazing technique which can be used literally all day and every day. This chapter discusses the tactic of what the Mishnah tells us, the Heve Shafel Ruach Bifnei Kol Adam. Be lowly of spirit before every man. That is the literal translation, which is suggested, this tactic of considering yourself as lowly or lower than every man is suggested as a result of the Beinoni or the potential Beinoni feeling superior. We did mention last chapter how this Timtum Halev results because of the arrogance of Sitra Achra, results because of the inflated ego of the animal soul. And therefore, sometimes the Beinoni could feel superior, or even the potential Beinoni, right? He could feel superior, and arrogance is what causes Timtum Halev. What is the solution for arrogance? The solution for arrogance is to feel the opposite of arrogance, to feel lowly and humble. And the Alter Rebbe tells us to feel lower even than someone who is called a Kal Shabakalim, someone who sins in all ways, someone who really, really doesn't take Torah mitzvah seriously, scoffs, and just really makes his life really easy by sinning quite a lot. Now, how do we do this? It's all very nice to say, you're arrogant, so now the solution is to feel humble, right? How do we do this? By learning about judging others. This is a fascinating, fascinating parak in Tanya. the human nature is that we judge others. We spend a lot of time judging others, looking at others' positions in life, looking at other people's behaviors. And the Mishnah states, Al tadin es chaverei ad shetagia limkoimoi. Do not judge your fellow until you have reached his place. Now, what does his place mean? His station. What does that mean? There are two ways we can explain this. First of all, physically. The Alter Rebbe gives us an example of someone whose workplace is in the street. And this person sees all sorts of temptations, as opposed to someone who sits at home all day learning Torah, for example, right? Or a very sheltered person, not exposed to the outside world. This person who we are judging, right, is actually someone who goes out into the world. In modern day terms, he's not closeted in his house. He's out in the world, and the result is that a person's Yetzer Hara is kindled and excited and burns like an oven. That's the description that the Alter Rebbe uses. And the Yetzer Hara is usually passionate, but now it is even more so, and therefore the person sins. That could be his makom. So don't judge a person until you come to his physical place. He is in a different physical place than you are. You are sitting at home. You are involved in holy pursuits. You are learning Torah. You are davening. And this person, he may be sinning because he's out there in the world, in the marketplace, on the street corners, seeing all sorts of tempting things before his eyes. So this is one way of not judging him and taking into account his place. The other way of taking into account his place is actually spiritually. Maybe you are judging another person that's on the streets while you are also on the streets. You are also out in the world. But your Yetzer Hara and his Yetzer Hara are different. Just as there are different types of animals, there are different levels and types of animalistic desires and Yetzer Haras. There are wild animals and tame animals. There's a bull, there's a lamb, there's passive animals, there's more aggressive animals, there's angry, passionate. Not all people will have the same reaction to temptation or stimulants. And therefore, we take into account Mekaimai, his spiritual station, relative immorality. We take into account not only his physical space, whereas like I'm sheltered, he's not. This could be in a situation where I'm out in the world and he's out in the world and he's sinning and I'm not. That's because I have a different Yetzer Hara to his Yetzer Hara. We're spiritually different, right? In other words, the question one has to ask oneself, following this dictum of the Mishnah, Al tadin es chaverei ad shetagia limkoimoi, is how would we behave if we were exposed? How would I behave if I were exposed to his problems and his temptations? Now, this is all a way of judging, right? This is how we should approach judging another person. This is not to say that a person is not sinning. It's not a justification for sin. And the person who sins is still considered a rasha because he is lacking a fear of God. He doesn't have this fear of God which keeps him from sinning and which enables him to conduct himself in a way of mayach shalit al halev, in a way of mind over heart. However, Tanya says an interesting thing. This is between man and Hashem, if he's sinning or he's not sinning. But when we judge, we have to take into account mekoimai. We can't simply say, oh, he sins and I don't. But the question one should ask oneself is, if I were in his situation, what would I do? In other words, I don't have the same situation as him. What would I do? But how can one actually measure this? And this is the crux of this parak of Tanya, which is so beautiful, and which basically, after you learn this parak of Tanya, you literally cannot judge anybody. How can one measure how you would behave in the same situation as somebody else, because you don't have the same situation as somebody else. You don't have the same temptation. You don't have the same Yetzer Hara. You're not in the same place. Tanya answers, Alter Rebbe answers this question by telling us to use a comparative struggle. When one uses a comparative struggle, and I'm going to explain that in a minute, when one uses a comparative struggle, one will realize that he is indeed the same as the sinner, as the person who's sinning, and not only the same, but possibly even lower than that sinner, which we will explain at the end of the parak. Now, what does a comparative struggle look like? Let's say another person is sinning in an area which is completely beyond your reality. You don't even have a temptation to sin in that area. So how would you find something similar which you struggle with to compare yourself to him? So we know that there are two aspects in serving Hashem. There is sur meira, which means avoid the bad, don't sin. There is also the area of asay tov, to do mitzvahs, to fulfill Torah mitzvahs, to keep on doing mitzvahs. Now, the question one should ask oneself in finding a comparative struggle is not in sur meira, it's not in avoiding sin, but it's in asay tov, in doing mitzvahs. In other words, the question that you ask yourself is, do I put in the amount of effort and struggle to do mitzvahs that I am expecting this kal shabakalim, the sinner, I am expecting him to put in an amount of effort and struggle to not sin, to not give in to his temptations? Am I putting in the same amount of effort and struggle to do mitzvahs? Maybe I don't have struggle. I don't have a struggle in the area of sin, but am I putting in that amount of effort and required to continuously do mitzvahs? And Tanya gives the example of davening. And why does Tanya give the example of davening? Because davening is something which is almost constant. It's 3 times a day. In the case of women, twice a day. 3 times a day. So therefore, similar to the person who battles his Yetzer Hara all day long, one can ask oneself, am I motivated to daven? Do I get up with alacrity and overcome my Yetzer Hara to daven with utmost kavanah? Okay, let's say I daven. And what about my davening? What standard is my davening? What quality is my davening? Am I able to have the proper kavanah at all times? And the Alter Rebbe says, don't think we're talking about having Kabbalistic intentions over here. We're talking about simply being transparent towards Hashem, not hiding anything, bearing your soul. How often and how easy is it for you to bear your soul to Hashem at the time of davening with the proper strength and kavanah? Tefillah with kavanah, davening with a proper intention, is a similar struggle to not sinning, because our body, our nefesh habahamis, interferes, prevents the godly soul. It's lazy. Our animal soul is lazy. It prefers rest and inactivity. It doesn't want to get up and do a mitzvah and daven and put in kavanah and put in the effort, right? The animal soul interferes in our davening specifically. This is the example that in the beginning of the parak, the Alter brings. And we have to reduce this resistance 3 times a day and more. Shema and brachas and davening and all. We have to daven numerous times a day, and the animal soul prefers to rest and prefers not to exert itself. It interferes in our kavanah, distracting us with all sorts of distracting thoughts. It's a similar battlefield, both in intensity, quantity, and consistency of the battle. It's a constant battle, very similar to the person who is on the street corners watching temptations pass him by all day long. And when we judge another person, the judgment, the Alter Rebbe tells us, is not by accomplishment. It's not by what the person has accomplished, but by the effort and sacrifice being made in the service of God. So what we expect when we judge another person, we're expecting something from them. We're having an expectation, what we expect from the lowest of the low, the kal shabakalim, the sinner, that he should overcome temptations, both external. We're expecting a lot. A person who sins because of external surroundings and also because of his internal Yetzer Hara, we're expecting him to overcome that. One has to ask oneself, am I capable of this kind of effort and struggle? And you figure out the answer by examining areas of your life where you struggle. Maybe davening is not your struggle. Maybe it's in a different area. And Alter brings a few examples, which we will enumerate shortly. But what the Alter Rebbe does say is that anyone who does not have this level of struggle with his body in order to daven properly or to perform other mitzvahs, in other words, great, you're just performing mitzvahs with lots of enthusiasm, no overcoming your Yetzer Hara, you're just motivated all the way. You have not reached the same level of struggle as one who struggles against his Yetzer Hara constantly and ends up sinning. That's why, again, we say in Pirkei Avos, Eizehu Gibor HaKovesh Es Yitzroi. Who is strong? Who is a Gibor? One who overcomes his temptation, his Yetzer Hara. It is very easy to overcome someone else's struggles, but one has to overcome one's own struggles. Now, what are the other examples that the Alter Rebbe brings? Because primarily, davening is brought as an example, and I think everyone can relate to davening, because we can daven on all sorts of levels. We could just say the words, we could put in a little bit of kavanah, a lot of kavanah, we could be lazy to daven, we could daven early, we could daven late. It is a constant struggle throughout the day. But the other examples that the Alter Rebbe brings as areas of struggle, which the Beinoni or the potential Beinoni can examine oneself, are when you make brachas on food, when you thank Hashem for eating, or birchas hamazon, when you bench after you finish eating, kavana in all the mitzvahs, not only davening, which Tanya will speak about later on, giving tzedakah or Torah study. The question that the Beinoni asks himself, or the potential Beinoni, is: are you studying Torah? Are you giving tzedakah? Are you performing mitzvahs more than what is in your nature, or more than what is habitual for you? Because what's in your nature and what's habitual for you is not a struggle. If you like helping other people, so you give a lot of tzedakah, that's within your nature. But if you give a little more than you're able to, that may be a struggle. If you are intellectual and you like studying and you like learning Torah, so therefore you're motivated to study, that's not a struggle for you. But if you learn a little bit more or longer than you are accustomed to, that's a struggle. If instead of saying brachas automatically, you put in a little bit of thought, that's a struggle. So these are all areas of struggle where one can compare oneself to a sinner who one tends to judge, like, why are they sinning? So firstly, we're told, put yourself in his place, both physically and spiritually. And if you can't put yourself in his place, think about the positive mitzvahs, which you're not doing maybe as well as you should do, and see if you are able to put in the same amount of effort and struggle as you are expecting from him. Now, seemingly, sins, committing a sin seemingly appears worse than omitting to do a mitzvah. But in the area of struggle, the Alter Rebbe says they are both the will of Hashem. The will of Hashem is not to sin, and the will of Hashem is to do mitzvahs. Therefore, one can use it as a comparative struggle. And let's say this Beinoni is on a very high level, and he still feels, I'm really serving Hashem well. I really don't have anything in common with the sinner, so therefore I am judging him. It's hard for me to judge him comparatively because I don't really have anything similar to him. I daven, I do mitzvahs, I go beyond my habitual nature. So then the Alter Rebbe says, even such a person should truly examine himself, and he should realize that even in the areas of sur meira, of avoiding sin, there may be some subtleties that he is not able to overcome. In other words, everyone is judged according to his level. So we know that our patriarchs were judged on a much higher level. A Benoni is also, therefore, being judged on a higher level because maybe he's not sinning overtly, but maybe there are certain subtleties. And interestingly enough, the Alter Rebbe brings an example from the Gemara. The son of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, he was named Rabbi Shimon. And one time there was a divorce document written with a mistake. And it wasn't him that wrote it. And he told his father, Yehuda the tailor wrote this in order to exonerate himself. Now, it wasn't such a bad thing to say about Yehuda the tailor, because what does a tailor know about writing a divorce decree or a document, right? So he's not denigrating the tailor in any way, but he was simply trying to exonerate himself. And even so, his father said to him, keep away from slander. Even if you're trying to exonerate yourself, keep away from slander. So the examples, and yes, very, very high level examples that the Alter Rebbe brings in this perek is if you really have nothing to compare yourself, you can't even find a comparative struggle in the area of doing mitzvahs, of asay tov, of davening, of giving tzedakah, of learning Torah, etc. You will realize that even in the area of avoiding sin, you are not perfect in your avoidance of evil, because maybe you are participating in a conversation, a pleasant conversation of gossip, which might contain a slight slur to somebody else, either for no reason or even for the reason of exonerating oneself. Another example that the Alter Rebbe brings that one can use to kind of like remember that don't judge another person because you're not perfect, right? Is in the areas of kadesh atzmacha b'mutar, which means elevating yourself to holiness in the areas of life which are permissible, which basically means taking the mundane and making the mundane holy. And surprisingly, that is actually a mitzvah in the Torah. It's a mitzvah from the Torah, v'hiskadashtem. So if you're not doing this, and it's quite hard to remember to do that always, right? To elevate the mundane, remember, and you want to bring yourself down a notch for the purpose of breaking your klippa, breaking your timtum halev. So remember, you can remember that in this area you are not perfect, and even some mitzvahs that don't come from the Torah, you are not perfect. This is speaking to the Benoni, who is obviously on a very, very high level and really near perfect in all his performance of other mitzvahs. In other words, Tanya is saying you may have become insensitive to some minor sinning, what you consider minor sinning. And in this case, you are no better than a kal shebakalim, the lowliest of sinners. Now, there's one thing we could say is that a person, when judging another, he could feel superior, and therefore Tanya explains, remember that in other areas you also have struggle and temptation, and you have to exert the same amount of effort. But how can we then say to ourselves, we're not only as low as the sinner, but we may be even worse than the sinner? And Tanya, Alter Rebbe ends this parak with a very, very beautiful, profound thought. Because sinners are not always aware of the gravity of their sin. However, people who learn Torah and are involved in godly pursuits should know better. And therefore, when you're trying to bring your animal soul down a notch, you could tell your animal soul that it's even worse than a sinner in this case, because you have all the information available to you. You have all the godly tools available to you. And yet you still are not exerting the same amount of effort and struggle as you expect from your fellow when you are judging him for sinning. And all this is to reflect upon another tool. All this is another tool, basically, to reflect upon, to break the complacency of the heart in order to become responsive to the light of Hashem, the light of the godly soul, and godly matters, which basically takes us back to the beginning in how to solve the Timtum Halev, which exists. So I personally think this is a beautiful, beautiful parak, because I tend to judge a lot. And you know, we judge other people, we judge other people's children, we judge other people in their circumstances. We look at other people and we say, look what they're doing. And to hear Tanya saying, are you exerting the same amount of effort and struggle in positive mitzvahs as you're expecting them to do to overcome their temptations and struggle? Well, if not, that's it. No more judging. You can't judge another person. And that is this parak. Next parak is actually very interesting because it's going to deal with the topic of, okay, if you do all this and you become depressed, then what? But we haven't gotten there yet. That's that's next parak. Any questions or observations? I could stay another 5 minutes because I have to go pick up my daughter. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say that. I was just going to say, like, this is an amazing chapter, but it's making me feel like even worse about myself, because I'm thinking, oh my gosh, there are so many areas I can improve in. So, but you said next chapter, so
yeah, but also, even without doing the next chapter, why would you feel worse about yourself? It's just a fact, right? It's just a tool to give us. It's just a tool to give us not to judge. Stop judging. You know the expression in English, people in glass houses don't throw stones. That's basically what this chapter is saying.
Except that what we tend to do is judge others because we really are judging ourselves.
Right.
I think that's part of the problem. And so,
right. But then we go back to last parak and we remember that however much we are judging ourselves, we're actually judging our perception of ourselves. Our true identity is the nefesh elokis, the godly soul. But our perception of ourselves is the body and our personality and the nefesh habahamis and how we respond to and act in this world.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Is there a name for this trying to be better in mitzvahs asay? As you said, like, is there like a term, like one word that called? It's not shuva, really. What is it called? It's not as hapcha. It's not as kafi. What is
Well,
this?
it could entail a lot of things. It could entail a lot of things. It's avodas Hashem.
Okay.
It's
But I
avodas
thought
Hashem
maybe
in
there's like
all
a specific.
areas. No. It's avodas Hashem, but we will see next chapter, and it's also appropriate because we're very soon coming up to the month of Elul, where most people err and they think that tshuva is really a serious business. Got to be really serious and sad about it. Yes, we do have to feel remorseful, but we will see in the next chapter how the Alter Rebbe says this whole process has to be done with joy, because going back to what we learned about the battle between the two souls, if one is not joyous, one can't win the battle. So you can't do tshuva if you're not happy about it. Oh yes, Nomi just said, I think this means not judging husbands. Of course. We have, in other words, what is the solution to not judging another person? The solution is to find a comparative struggle. Not to say, I don't do that. He does that, but I don't do that. Oh, but what about other areas where you don't do? That's comparative. That takes the same amount of effort and struggle. Or what about other areas where you should be doing something? You're not actively doing something, but you're not it's a sin of omission, right? It's the best tactic for not judging. Okay, so let me just find the